Mysterious Ancient Mariners.
Part 13. The Crucible of the Carthaginian Conflict. Regulus's debacle at Carthage left the Roman Senate divided. The question of rescuing the survivors in Aspis became the subject of a bitter debate. News of Regulus's disaster had so shocked some Romans that they wanted nothing more to do with an African adventure, and even favored leaving the remnants of the expeditionary force to die in Africa. Other voices urged a rescue by the navy, and one senator warned that if Rome left those brave men to their fate, the Roman people would utterly disgrace themselves in the eyes of the whole world. Those who favored a relief expedition eventually won out. The fleet returned, and reinforced by the 40 vessels that had been left behind in Africa in the preceding autumn, engaged the enfeebled Punic navy. Few details of the battle have emerged from ancient accounts, but by its conclusion the Romans had managed to capture 114 Carthaginian ships, virtually undamaged, crews and all. Only about 16 Carthaginian vessels were destroyed during the encounter. The Carthaginians apparently allowed themselves to be trapped close to shore, and many of their vessels were simply driven onto the beach. Filled out now by its Carthaginian prizes, a prodigious Roman fleet of 464 war galleys and numerous horse transports soon afterward reached the waters off the southern coast of Sicily in June. Then came disaster, a disaster too total for men to have inflicted on one another. Yet men played their part. Fortune was not so much to blame as the commanders themselves, wrote the historian Polybius. The consuls who led the fleet were constantly warned by their pilots not to push along the exposed southern Sicilian coast. Not only were the shores harborless, but, as the pilots pointed out, the area was notoriously susceptible to sudden storms from late June through July. The consuls ignored the warnings. They had no appreciation of the power of a storm at sea, and in any case, they were intent on putting fear and awe into the Carthaginian coastal cities along their way. As Polybius explained, it is a peculiarity of the Roman people as a whole to treat everything as a question of main strength, to consider that they must of course accomplish whatever they have proposed to themselves, and that nothing is impossible that they have once determined upon. That was all very well on land, he said, where their only adversaries were men. But to contend with the sea and sky is to fight against a force immeasurably superior to their own. The storm hit the Romans off the craggy coast of Camarina. The enormous fleet, shambling eastward with its transport ships and unwieldy galleys, was driven onto the rocks. The tempest may have been no more than one of the hard westerly winds that often strike the Sicilian coast in midsummer, but for the low-built warships it was catastrophic. First, they stowed their wind-ripped sails. Then, as the waves mounted, they blocked their oar ports to keep from being flooded. With neither sails nor oars, the galleys were at the mercy of the storm entirely. The seas came over the bulwarks, sweeping marines and soldiers overboard and pouring below decks to drown the oarsmen on their benches. The unwieldy ravens were a lethal handicap now. The top-heavy galleys lurched wildly, many of them foundering. And in the transports, thousands of Carthaginian prisoners captured at sea waited in helpless terror until their vessels sank under the waves. Other ships were dashed against the rocks, where they went to pieces, wrote Polybius, and filled all the seaboard with corpses and wreckage. So numerous were the Carthaginian prizes that the whole fleet was probably fatally unmanned. The losses were the greatest yet suffered by a fleet on the sea. Of the 464 war galleys and scores of transport ships, only 80 survived. No ancient historian ventured to count the dead, who must have numbered some 100,000. Yet such was the resilience of the Romans that they immediately proceeded to build a new fleet, and with astonishing speed. During the winter of 255 to 254, they constructed 140 more galleys. Later in the year, these ships joined the remnant of 80 that had ridden out the previous summer's storm and attacked and subdued Carthaginian towns in Sicily. But fate seemed to have turned against Rome. In 253, as the fleet was returning from Sicily under the consul Caius Sempronius Blaius, it was struck by storm again. Of its 200 ships, more than 150 went to the bottom, along with tens of thousands of trained rowers and soldiers, or they were dashed to bits against the southern shore of Italy. From this blow, even the Romans took time to recover. They did not resume naval warfare against Carthage until the summer of 250 BC, when some 120 war galleys blockaded Lilybaeum, Carthage's chief stronghold in Sicily, while the Roman army pressed in by land. But the tide seemed still to be running in the favor of the Carthaginians. Their agile ships continually outmaneuvered the clumsy Roman galleys, running the blockade to supply their besieged city. And one day, a Carthaginian fleet of 50 galleys swept down on the Romans before a powerful following wind and temporarily lifted the blockade entirely. Worse was yet to come. The Romans had scarcely succeeded in re-establishing their blockade when a single galley captained by another Hannibal, called the Rhodian, from his place of origin, ran right through their line of ships and into the harbor in broad daylight. The insulted Romans reacted by positioning their 10 fastest vessels near the harbor mouth to catch Hannibal if he tried to come out in the same audacious fashion. Yet he did so with aplomb, and wrote Polybius, not only sailed out without receiving any damage to ship or crew, scudding along the bows of the enemy as though they were fixed in their places, but even brought his ship to, after running a short way ahead, and with his oars out and ready, seemed to challenge the foe to a contest. When none of them ventured to put out to attack him, because of the spread of his rowing, he sailed away, having thus with one ship successfully defied the entire fleet of the enemy. The humiliated Romans finally got their revenge when a swift Carthaginian quadrireme ran aground on the harbor mole and the blockaders captured it. In this vessel, the Romans placed a picked crew of oarsmen and soldiers and lay in wait for Hannibal. The Rhodian sailed out from harbor in his usual insolent manner the very next day, and was startled to see the quadrireme bearing down on him. The Roman rowers overhauled the galley, and he was taken prisoner. The lesson was not lost on Hannibal's colleagues. Efforts to run the Roman blockade came to a virtual halt. The Romans had also learned a valuable lesson from this experience, gradually changing their galley design from the ponderous troop carriers to faster, more maneuverable quinquiremes patterned after the Carthaginian craft. In the process, they abandoned their clumsy but effective raven as well. Evidently, they considered that a boarding bridge would not be as necessary in their new warships. And certainly, the storm off Sicily had demonstrated the vulnerability of the raven-equipped galley. But to give it up so quickly may have been a blunder, as the Romans now learned to their cost. Their problem was compounded by bull-headed leaders in command of inexperienced oarsmen. In the summer of 249, a fleet of 120 Roman galleys formed up to attack a Carthaginian force of 100 vessels that lay at anchor in the Sicilian port of Drepanum. In Lilybaeum's harbor, 12 miles away, the Roman consul Publius Claudius Pulcher hurried to set sail against the enemy fleet before it escaped. But he reckoned without the fleet's augurs, priestly attendants without whose blessings no major Roman military decision was made. Augurs in turn received their guidance from birds, in this case a flock of sacred chickens aboard the flagship. And now the augurs pointed to a bad omen for the expedition. The sacred chickens were not feeding. "If they won't eat, they can drink," retorted Pulcher in a fury and had them thrown overboard. The Roman fleet set out near midnight, seeking the advantage of surprise. When the Roman galleys appeared over the horizon at dawn, the talented Carthaginian admiral Adherbal hastily assembled his forces and outlined a plan for defense. Its key was the layout of the harbor of Drepanum, which had 2 entrances. Adherbal's men boarded their galleys and waited until Pulcher's fleet arrived. As Adherbal had hoped, the slow-witted Pulcher sent all his galleys through one entrance. The Carthaginian fleet promptly raced out through the other. The Romans fell into confusion. By the time they realized what had happened, some of their ships were inside the harbor, while others were pouring through the entrance, and others, including Pulcher's flagship, were still outside. Pulcher, at least, had the sense to realize that he was being lured into the same trap the Carthaginians had been in. He ordered his galleys in the harbor to come out. They then became entangled with the other Roman vessels at the entrance, hulls bumping and oars snapping. At last, they formed a ragged line outside the harbor, their sterns to the shore and their prows to the enemy. But now they lay so close to the shore that they had no room to maneuver. The Carthaginians, swarming out of the harbor's passage, swooped down on the huddled Roman front. But instead of charging in force, as the Romans would have preferred, Adherbal sent his galleys darting at the line, ramming and quickly retreating. Now the lack of ravens spelled the Romans' doom. Unable to grapple with the attackers, they could not send their marines onto the enemy's decks. Instead of the Romans' favorite form of naval combat, an infantry battle at sea, it was now a classic ship-against-ship contest, at which the Carthaginians excelled. When one of the unwieldy Roman ships charged out of the line, it was immediately surrounded by quick Carthaginian galleys and cut off. When a Roman vessel tried to slip around behind the line, it ran aground on the shoals along Sicily's shore. Slowly, the whole Roman line began to disintegrate. Many galleys were sunk, others became stranded on the shore, and their crews escaped into the interior. Pulcher fled with a mere 27 ships on his left wing, leaving 93 sunk or captured behind him with 20,000 men lost. The gods of the weather delivered the final death blow. Soon after the debacle off Drepanum, the Romans scraped together the last of their navy, 120 galleys and 800 transports, and sent it to reinforce the blockade at Lilybaeum. En route, near the same Sicilian shore, where a storm had wrecked a Roman fleet in 255, another tempest struck. The Carthaginians wisely anchored in the shelter of a tall headland, but the Romans were scattered to the winds and lost all but 2 of their ships. By the end of the year 249, the naval might of the Roman Republic had been reduced to a pitiful 20 galleys, and Carthage was once again mistress of the seas. But only for a time. For 5 years, the Romans abandoned the sea, wrote Polybius. Meanwhile, the heavily fortified Carthaginian port cities of Sicily, supplied by the sea, successfully held out against Rome's most determined attacks overland. Because the Roman treasury was now impoverished, the Senate made an appeal to the country's leading citizens to fit out yet another fleet. So wealthy were these pillars of the Republic that the new 200 quinquereme Roman navy rose swiftly from the wreckage of the old, and by the year 242 BC, Consul Gaius Latucius Catulus was prepared to sail against the Carthaginians once again. Catulus intercepted some 170 Carthaginian ships off of Sicily's Aegates Islands and proceeded to engage in a classic ramming action. The enemy admiral, unprepared for a Roman fleet employing the Carthaginian method of sea warfare, was soundly beaten, and most of his armada was completely destroyed. He escaped to Carthage, where he met the customary fate of a defeated Carthaginian, on the cross. In the moment of victory, Rome negotiated a treaty with Carthage. Thus, in 241 BC, the First Punic War ended, with all of Sicily at last ceded to the Republic on the banks of the Tiber. During the succeeding century, Rome and Carthage fought 2 more Punic Wars. It was in the next one that the famous Hannibal, unable to attack the Italian coast because of Rome's superior fleet, was forced to land in Spain and lead his army, elephants and all, over the Alps. The expedition bogged down in the mountainous Italian terrain, and Hannibal eventually returned to Carthage in defeat. The final Punic War ended in disaster for the Carthaginians when the Roman navy blockaded their home city in North Africa, and Roman soldiers then razed it. By 146 BC, what had been the maritime capital of the Mediterranean was now a plowed field, its furrows sown with salt so that nothing would grow. Carthage would never endanger the Republic again. Half a century earlier, a Rhodian galley had rowed up the Tiber to invite the Roman navy into the eastern Mediterranean. Ever since Alexander the Great's empires had been divided up, the island nation of Rhodes had been playing a delicate game, providing a balance of power between the larger warring factions of Macedonia and Egypt. But by the end of the 3rd century BC, the Egyptian navy had been somewhat neglected, and Macedonia's mighty fleet threatened to dominate the eastern reaches of the Great Sea. Hence the Rhodian request for aid. Rome responded with 50 of its swift new quinqueremes. Together with the Rhodian navy, they overwhelmed the Macedonians and compelled them to sue for peace. The Roman galleys then returned home, but the Romans had caught the eastern virus. Here was rich new ground for their expanding empire. They had moved to exploit it, at the expense of their Rhodian ally. Rome proceeded not by warfare, but by astute commercial politics. In 167 BC, the Romans acquired the island of Delos, which was strategically located in the midst of the eastern Mediterranean's trading nations. Then they ceded it to Athens on condition that the island would be maintained as a free port, levying no customs duties. Within 1 year, this free port had reduced the trade of Rhodes to a fraction of its previous level. The entire luxury traffic of the Mediterranean world, spices, incense, slaves, flooded into Delos, and Rhodes was limited to receiving grain and wine, largely because of the heavy vessels carrying these commodities requires Rhodes' deep harbor. Delos became an entrepot of Levantine dynamism and acumen. Greeks, Phoenicians, Syrians, Jews, Arabs, even merchants from the Red Sea and beyond set up their offices there and turned Delos into a port of Babel. A local saying ran through the area, "Merchant, sail in and unload. Everything's as good as sold." And there Middle Easterners were met by Rome's middlemen, the Greeks of southern Italy, who paid in cash, wine, and olive oil for the luxuries the Romans wanted. Trouble then came from an unexpected quarter. For years, Rhodes's navy had policed the eastern Mediterranean and kept it free from pirates. Now, that navy was in decline, but Rome had no interest in assuming its policing role. Indeed, pirates provided a welcome source of slaves for Rome's western markets. The unhindered corsairs multiplied. Those of Cilicia, on the rugged southern coast of Asia Minor, virtually formed a pirate nation, with a fleet of some 1,000 ships. The pirates cruised at will through the eastern Mediterranean and soon extended their range westward to infest even the shores of Italy. They forced protection money from coastal cities and kidnapped Roman noblewomen within a few miles of the capital, holding them for ransom. 2 government dignitaries were abducted along with their staffs. A consular flotilla was attacked while at anchor in Rome's port of Ostia. Only when pirates overran Delos and sacked the port in 69 BC did Rome at last respond. In 67 BC, the People's Assembly turned to a skilled administrator named Pompey, directing him to use whatever force he considered necessary to wipe out piracy throughout the Mediterranean. Pompey proceeded on a mammoth campaign. He requisitioned ships from every province and tributary nation, creating separate fleets under separate leaders, and ordered a simultaneous attack on pirate bases all over the sea. His master plan worked. The Mediterranean was swept clean from west to east. Pompey did not execute all of the pirates, but settled the most promising as farmers in the hinterlands of the Roman world, thereby removing the temptation for them to resume their campaign of harassment. But now Rome was beset by danger from within. For a period of almost 3 decades after Pompey cleared the sea of pirates, the Republic was racked by civil strife. First, Pompey and Julius Caesar battled for dominance. Both died at the hands of assassins. Then Caesar's grandnephew Octavian, combining guile and force, liquidated one after another would-be successor to Caesar, all but the veteran general Mark Antony. The 2 survivors formed a wary alliance, dividing Rome's territorial possessions between them, and Octavian taking Italy and the west, and Antony laying claim to the east, where he joined forces with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. But Octavian, true to the spirit of his great-uncle, wanted it all. So, the stage was now set for the last of the great Roman civil wars. A conflict decided, finally, not by armies, but by 2 titanic fleets of galleys whose clashes spelled the end of one era and the dawn of another.